Hello everyone, welcome back for another edition of the Money Pros. I'm Oliver Tutz, Certified Financial Planner Practitioner, and I'll be your host for the next half hour as we talk about all the issues related to your money, how to make it, how to keep it, and hopefully how to help it grow. Let me give you an idea of what we're going to cover on today's show because we've got a lot to get to. First up, an interesting research study that came across my desk, and I'm going to share it with you guys. 6 personality traits that were common among people that were multimillionaires. So is there something about various personality traits that can be identified that's indicative of accumulating wealth? So we're going to talk about what some of those things are, what this research uncovered. Then in our second segment, we're going to be talking to our estate planning pro, Karen DelPonte with Cameron and Mittleman. We're going to be talking about a couple of things, really, some developments in estate planning for 2019, also some of the challenges that we're seeing more and more of in the estate planning process as it relates to our new sort of digital economy and some of the things that we didn't have to think about maybe 20 years ago that now we do have to think about when it comes to estate planning and for a lot of financial decisions for that matter. So we're going to talk about that in the second segment. In the third segment, more on the technology front, we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence and how it's being used with 401k plan providers and some interesting things that we're learning from people's interaction with that artificial intelligence in terms of how well they understand their 401ks. So we're going to talk about that in the third segment. So lots to get to. Let's jump right into it. And first up, I want to talk about this study that I read about 6 key traits to becoming wealthy. Now, I'm fascinated by this because if there's any of these traits that I can adopt, I'm going to be all about them, right? So maybe you'll feel the same way. So we want to look into that. And it was a study done by a wealth firm, and they wrote a book called The Next Millionaire Next Door. You'll recall probably 15 years ago there was a very popular book written called The Millionaire Next Door, and this is called The Next Millionaire Next Door. So the idea here is they researched those that have become wealthy. So we're not talking about inherited wealth, parents' money, lottery winnings, things like that. We're talking about people that earned their wealth, and the study wanted to seek to identify if there were common personality traits among these people that would be indicative of how they got where they got. So I want to take you through some of these and talk about maybe my experience with them and the research study, what was indicated there. So let's throw up the slide and we're going to go through these one by one. And the first one is frugality. Now, I don't think there's really any surprise here. The reality is, and I always say this to people, the fundamental first thing you got to be worried about when it comes to your financial planning is you got to spend less than you make. And this is especially true for people that accumulated wealth. They also indicated there was a greater reward to living below your means than living at or above your means, despite people's desire to accumulate things. So frugality was definitely a leading trait for those that become wealthy. Next up, confidence. Now, I think this is an interesting one. But people that have gained wealth had a great deal of confidence. They weren't timid or unsure about their financial moves. Now, I see this with investors a lot. Those that have confidence in their long-term investment plans are a lot less likely to make mistakes, but entrepreneurs and other people really have to believe in what they're doing and have an unwavering confidence that the consequences are going to be positive. Next one, and this is one that I think a lot of people wrestle with in our culture today, and that's responsibility. The idea that your future, and specifically we're talking here about your financial future, is not entirely left up to fate or luck, that you have a lot to do with how things turn out. So you got to take some responsibility for it. Next one, planning, setting goals for your financial future. There's an old saying that says, we don't plan to fail, we fail to plan. Planner is in my financial title. Obviously, I believe that planning is a key to accumulating wealth. Second to last, focus. I think this is an interesting one. A single-minded determination to succeed. I think a lot of us want to accumulate wealth, but we're not always determined to do that. People that have accumulated significant wealth, the ultra wealthy, had a single-mindedness to them that was unique. And the last one, and I think this is really important, social indifference. not worrying about keeping up with the Joneses or worrying about what your friends, family, or other people tell you about your plan. Certainly this is particularly true for entrepreneurs. Some guy decides he wants to sell books on the internet and he's going to put Barnes & Noble out of the business, and the next thing you know, he's the richest man in the world because he started Amazon. So you really have to have social indifference in your own determination. So interesting study. I encourage you to check it out online if you're so inclined. Up next, we're going to be talking to Karen DelPonte with Cameron Mittleman about challenges in this new digital culture we're in when it comes to estate planning. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Money Pros. I'm joined by our estate planning pro, Karen DelPonte, attorney and partner with Cameron Mittleman. Karen, great to have you back on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you.
A little bit of a mixed bag, but really kind of all related. We want to talk about some updates for 2019. I'm still can't get used to saying 2019, but with respect to estate planning, both on the federal and state level, but also things that you're seeing when it comes to 2019 that are changes, challenges, differences in the playing field. A lot of it related to sort of our new digital, money culture. So we want to talk about all of those things. So let's start off with there have been several changes on the federal and state estate tax law level, and I'm wondering if you can sort of give us a rundown of the major things. I imagine it's pages and pages, if not books and books long, but some of the major things that are likely to impact our viewers as they're listening to this.
Certainly. The major changes were really in the income tax arena, but you did see some changes in the estate and gift tax side. We still have an unlimited marital exemption, meaning whatever you leave to a spouse on both the state and federal level, no estate tax. So we're talking about leaving assets to a party other than a spouse. The estate exemption last year on the federal level was $11.1 million. It's up to $11.4 million per deceased this year.
So underlining a couple points here, as much money can go to the spouse as needed because there's no limit. But on the federal level, once it's a non-spouse, you're talking about an $11 million.
Correct.
Now, a lot of people hearing that, it's $11 million, I'm out. I don't have to tune in. But there's more to the story than that.
Well, there's more to the story if you live in places like Rhode Island and Massachusetts, because you're also dealing with a state estate tax.
Right.
So Massachusetts is at $1 million, has been at $1 million for a long time, no changes
Not
in
indexed
sight.
for inflation
Not
or
at
anything
all.
like that.
No. Rhode Island, on the other hand, is at $1.5 million, indexed for inflation. Now we're up to $1,561,000 and change, $719. So right now, it's going up very slowly. So as a married couple, bottom line, you can leave approximately $3 million to your children, your other beneficiaries in the aggregate as a married couple at the by the second death.
So it can give our viewers some idea of the impact that, say, a Rhode Island estate tax would have on somebody whose estate was larger than $3 million, or they didn't do proper planning and they started to incur an estate tax. Because it's not a small number. You end up talking about thousands of dollars you're giving over to the state of Rhode Island. You do.
I mean, it is much better than it was before because now you're just taxed on the excess, but you're looking at roughly, at a tax rate between roughly 4% and 16%. And the 16% rate is when you're up in an estate of approximately $10 million. So especially looking at higher net worth individuals, you could be talking about significant dollars that could go in estate taxes. People today are much more mobile, and they're looking at the fact that 37 states do not have a state estate tax. So people are forum shopping now.
37 states. Wow, okay.
So people are looking at a state like Florida or New Hampshire, where they don't have a state estate tax, and they also don't have a state income tax, and very often that's a driver as well.
It's an attractive
so
equation.
People are looking at where do I live and why.
Right. Now, at least on the federal level, and I guess on the state level in states where we have an estate tax, we have a uniform or a integrated system, I don't know what the right word would be, of estate taxes and gift taxes. Have there been changes in the gift tax limits, whether it be federal or the states we'd be concerned with around here?
So Rhode Island and Massachusetts do not have state gift taxes, even though they have estate taxes. On the federal level with the gift tax, it's unified with the estate, meaning it's the same exemption as you have when you die. So if I have that $11.4 million exemption when I die, if I've given $1 million to my daughter yesterday and then I die, I now have a $10.4 million exemption to use. So in the aggregate, whether you make lifetime gifts or leave assets at death, each person has that $11.4 million gift and/or bequest limit to use.
So it's a fairly significant amount of money that can be given away.
Definitely.
Okay.
And then over and above that, you can give $15,000 a year to as many people as you would like each calendar year, and that does not reduce that $11.4 million. You also can directly pay educational expenses and directly pay medical expenses, and that also doesn't reduce the $11.4 million.
So if you want to have the joy of seeing people you care about use the money while you're alive, there's a lot of opportunity to do that without any estate or gift tax impact. And I think it's also worth reminding people that the gift tax is not paid by the person that receives the money,
Correct.
which is what people oftentimes think. This is a tax that people that are giving the money have to worry about.
That's correct. And the only thing people really need to keep in mind is that when you give an asset away, it's a carryover basis. So if I bought a house for $100,000 and want to give it to my child, and it's now worth $500,000, they're going to get it with a tax basis of $100,000. Whereas if I die owning that house and it's worth $500,000, they get a step up which wipes out the capital gain. So I just always caution people, it can sound good to make a gift, but sometimes you're better off holding on to an asset until you die.
Think about the assets you're giving away
Exactly.
from a tax standpoint. I'm curious, with a lot of, the limits are so high, particularly on the federal level, maybe not so much in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, but a lot of states without an estate tax. A lot of conversations, the great debate, conservative versus liberal, and a lot of people advocating for eliminating the federal estate tax entirely. Is taxes still a primary concern when it comes to estate planning, or are other issues, ancillary issues, driving the equation more these days?
I think people initially go into planning thinking, I want to save taxes, but as they really get into it, they realize there are a lot of other factors why people need to do planning. When you think of it, if you have minor children and something happens to you, you need somebody to manage these assets on their behalf. If you have somebody in your family who has certain challenges or impairments, it may not be appropriate to leave them an outright bequest. So there are a lot of reasons that people need to look at planning that really aren't tax-driven.
Privacy, control,
Definitely.
care, simplicity for loved ones after you pass.
Definitely.
Those seem to be more and more the things that people are placing priorities on. Now let's get to the other part of the conversation. As we see, I had an interesting conversation with a group of young people about money, and one of the things that really struck me hard is how nobody uses cash anymore. And so a lot of the techniques that I use for saving, like putting change away or saving your fives or whatever, they're like, what's a five? I don't know what that is. What are you seeing in the estate planning arena with respect to technology that is changing the things you have to be concerned about as you address estate planning concerns?
I'm really trying to encourage people to look at how they manage their finances and to say to themselves, if I was gone yesterday, how would someone access this information? How would someone handle it on my behalf or on behalf of my loved ones? And a lot of times it's as simple as coming back to passwords and saying, how would people get in your devices? How would people get financial information? You may think bills are on auto pay, but if your paycheck isn't going into the account or the Social Security isn't going into the account because you're deceased, how does anyone figure that out to know that there's not money in the account to pay the bills that keep coming? So it's really become a challenge if people don't give access to a trusted friend, loved one, etc., to give them access to information. That's becoming a big challenge.
So the old style way people would do it is, let's say mom and dad are passed away, and mom was the last one to go. You go to the house, and the mail comes in, right?
Right.
You say, oh, I got the MetLife statement, and I've got the Bank of America statement, so you kind of know, but a lot of that stuff isn't coming via the mail anymore.
People
right?
aren't getting that in the mail anymore. They're getting their bills online, they're paying their bills online, they're not getting statements from their financial houses, so we're not getting that paper trail through the mail. So it really becomes very important to know What are they doing online? How do we get access to these accounts that all have different passwords that change? So people really need to think about, how do I keep track of my passwords? How do I make that accessible to the right people? Do I use an online password keeper? Or what are the tools out there I really should be looking at? We also see things in the media about one poor woman was trying to access her husband's iPhone to get pictures and whatever, and she didn't have his password and couldn't access anything. So it goes to those type of issues as well.
So not just financial assets,
Exactly.
but just personal documents, pictures, videos, things like that that you want to keep.
Exactly, and you also might want to have language in a power of attorney or in a will or a trust that's giving your executor, your financial agent, the right to get access to digital assets on your behalf, so that even if you're alive, if you're incapacitated, they can deal with a Facebook page, an Instagram account, etc.
Only about 45 seconds left. What about things like digital currencies, Bitcoin and things like that? I mean, you weren't dealing with that 10 years ago, right?
Absolutely not. And I think you've always got to think, how would people find out about this?
Right.
How would people know I had this? And how would people get access to it?
So a breadcrumb trail, list of accounts, passwords, because even if your next of kin has the power of attorney and all the documents, if they don't know about the account or they don't have access to the account, a lot of these places don't even have phone numbers. So
Exactly.
if you can't get in online, I'm not sure what happens.
Exactly.
Great advice. Not something I ever would have thought about. I never
No.
thought that I wasn't going to be able to talk to people about cash and what to do with it. So
Exactly.
thanks very much.
My
Great to have
pleasure.
you as always.
Thank
All right,
you.
up next we're going to be talking about how artificial intelligence is impacting what we know about how people understand their 401ks. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Money Pros. Really interesting as we think about technology and how it's impacting everything with investments. We were just talking about how it's impacting estate planning, it's impacting savings, it's impacting just a broad swath of our lives, and finances are no different. Interesting research report that came out from the founders of an online 401k platform. So 401ks have been online for a while now, so that's not particularly revolutionary. But what's interesting about this particular 401k platform, and it's called Dream Forward, and this is not a advocacy for that particular platform, but I think some of the information they have is useful. This 401k platform called Dream Forward, the founders wrote a report called What Artificial Intelligence Reveals About 401k Plans. So here's the thing about this particular platform. They use artificial intelligence in something called a chat bot to help people with their 401ks. So if your 401k plan, your employer uses this platform, and you're a participant in this 401k, you go online and you'll have an opportunity for a chat session, and you'll actually be chatting with the computer. You won't be talking with an actual person on the other end. So they use artificial intelligence, or an artificial intelligence chatbot apparently, to help people answer questions and make decisions about their 401k. Now that in and of itself is interesting enough, and you have to wonder how this technology is going to progress and if this is going to make people's lives easier, or like many of us, we talk to computer and we simply get frustrated and tune out. But the other interesting piece of this is, because they have this system, they've been able to aggregate a lot of data on what people are confused about and where the misunderstandings are. So there's a lot of news out there about people, Americans, and their struggles and the shortfall in retirement savings. And a lot of things are blamed when it comes to struggling with retirement savings. Loss of pension benefits, stagnating growth of wages for the middle class. So there's a variety of different things that are blamed, but it raises the question, is the possibility that one reason we're struggling with retirement is because so many of us have 401ks available to us, but we don't really understand them. So I thought this study was interesting because it points out that people are struggling with their 401ks in maybe some of the areas that experts like me might not have expected. So I'm going to throw up a slide here, and I'm going to talk about the most common 401k questions that the AI chatbot has to deal with on this particular 401k platform. So the first one is, how does a 401k match work? And of course, the match is an employer contribution to the plan. If you're putting in money, the employer will match it. But people have a lot of questions about that. Next one, how does money get into the account? Now, this is an example of a question I think most people would understand, but people have difficulty understanding about payroll deduction. The third question, how does a 401k impact my taxes? We talk about taxes a lot here on the Money Pros. It's no secret that people are confused about them. It's not a wonder that people would be confused about how 401ks impact their taxes. And finally, how do I do a rollover? One of the most common transactions as it relates to people that own a 401k, particularly as you move from employer to employer. But there's a great deal of confusion about how that process works, how to avoid taxes and penalties, what paperwork to fill out, what's required, what you can and can't do with that process. So this chatbot, the data that they've been able to aggregate with this tool really indicates that people are struggling with things like basic terminology, they're struggling with the administrative process when it comes to 401ks, and they're certainly struggling with the investment decisions that they have to make within the 401k. 401k really came into prevalence 20, 30 years ago, and it slowly replaced the normal pension fund. But there are definitely some changes that need to be made because we do have problems with the retirement savings here in America, and there's certainly reason to be concerned that the complexity of a 401k plan is one of the big reasons why people are no longer saving enough for retirement. So, some thoughts there. All right, up next, if you've got a question for the Money Pros, we'll tell you how to ask it. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Money Pros. A lot of you have questions for the Money Pros. We want to encourage you to ask them. So here's how you can do it. I'm going to throw up the contact information, and it's always great when people take advantage of this. So this is my plug to get more questions here on the show. First off, you can visit the Money Pros Facebook page. Go on, like the page. You can post a question on the Facebook page, or if you want to be more private about it, send us a message. Those messages come to me, and I often answer the questions directly through Facebook. So I love those questions, and we might even use them on the air. Second way is to visit foxprovidence.com. You can find the Money Pros and send an Ask the Pros question. And finally, you can email us, moneypros@foxprovidence.com. We answer all our questions, and sometimes we even answer them on the air. So please share them with us. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next Sunday right here on the Money Pros. Take care, folks.